Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, Wilder historian Dr. Lucas Wilder, and this episode begins my animated battle map series for the Atlanta Campaign. Similar to perceptions during the Civil War, the Eastern Theater got and gets more attention from Americans and fans of history. Therefore, some of the animations for this series will be less detailed, and I apologize for that. However, because the animations won't be as detailed, I will be attempting to put together a detailed account of the politics within the armies and the repercussions of the various battles of the campaign. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. The end of November 1863 was full of humiliation for the Confederate Army of Tennessee. Within a short time, the various Union armies concentrated at Chattanooga and dislodged the Confederates from Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, sending the rebels running into northern Georgia. The only bright spot in the situation for the Confederacy was the amazing stand of Major General Patrick Cleburne, who held off attacks at Ringgold Gap, giving time for the Army of Tennessee's wagon train to make it to safety. The Army of Tennessee's commander, General Braxton Bragg, resigned his post as its commander in early December, and would become one of the advisors for Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy. The President now needed to make a tough decision as to who would replace Bragg. He had a few options. He could either choose from any of the 4 full generals within the Confederacy, or raise a lieutenant general to that rank. Of the full generals, the highest ranking was Samuel Cooper, whose age prevented him from taking the field, so he acted in an administrative capacity in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee was the next in line, but he already commanded the Army of Northern Virginia, and if he moved Lee west, that still left the problem of filling the role of commander of one of the 2 largest armies in the Confederacy. The last 2 full generals that Davis could choose were Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard and Joseph E. Johnston. Davis didn't like either of the 2 men. Their squabbles over rank and strategy kept them from the president's good graces. Of the 2, Johnston had the most experience commanding an army, and he was good at administrative work as an army commander. Davis looked at his lieutenant generals, including James Longstreet, William Hardee, and Leonidas Polk. Longstreet demonstrated a lack of ability and independent command while in East Tennessee. Hardee was acting as commander of the Army of Tennessee after Bragg left, but he said he didn't want that responsibility, and Polk caused numerous problems inside the army and on the battlefield. There was really only one choice afforded to Davis, and that was to pick Johnston as the new commander of the Army of Tennessee, stationed in the northern Georgia town of Dalton. As Davis battled with that question, the Union victories at Chattanooga elevated the star of Major General Ulysses S. Grant even higher. Parts or the whole of the Army of the Cumberland, Army of the Tennessee, and Army of the Potomac came together to defeat Bragg at Chattanooga. Grant, as commander of the Military Division of the Mississippi, commanded that force at Chattanooga, and indeed basically all Union forces between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. His successful capture of Fort Henry and Donelson, defeat of the Confederacy at Shiloh, capture of Vicksburg, and the dislodging of Confederate forces from Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge around Chattanooga would elevate Grant. President Abraham Lincoln called Grant to Washington in early 1864, and in mid-March promoted Grant to the rank of lieutenant general, a rank only one man had held before him, George Washington, although Winfield Scott held that rank as a brevet promotion. That rank put Grant at the head of all Union forces. In the upcoming 1864 campaign season, Grant would put his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac so he could watch its progress and hopefully help it win victories that was sorely needed, or at least gain significant ground. However, this left his position as commander of the Military Division of the Mississippi open. Who would he choose to lead the other offensive, this one into Georgia, as he guided the other through Virginia? Of the generals in and around Chattanooga, Major General George Thomas ranked highest in seniority and was a solid and dependable general. He helped stave off defeat at Stones River and prevented a defeat at Chickamauga from becoming a disaster. However, there were things going against him. One, he was a Virginian who decided to stay loyal to the Union, so he didn't have any politicians looking out for him in Washington. And 2, Thomas had been loyal to both of his predecessors who the War Department didn't like. One was William S. Rosecrans as the commander of the Army of the Cumberland, the army Thomas now commanded, and Don Carlos Buell as commander of the Army of the Ohio. Thomas's reputation for being a slow-moving general didn't help him either. Grant would choose his most trusted subordinate to lead the effort to capture Atlanta, William T. Sherman. Sherman didn't have the record that Thomas had, but Grant trusted Sherman and knew with Sherman in charge of the army in the West and with himself overseeing the operations in the East that they could work better together than any duo in the Union. Grant and Sherman met in Cincinnati to plan their respective campaigns. During this meeting with Grant, the two generals decided that Grant would concentrate on Lee in Virginia with the goal of capturing Richmond, and Sherman was to attack Joseph E. Johnston's Army of Tennessee in Georgia with the goal of capturing Atlanta. The Union now had two men who would work together to bring the war to a close, and 1864 would be a joint effort on the part of Grant and Sherman. Northern Georgia, where Sherman would face Johnston, beginning at Dalton, was going to be a difficult area for the Union general to operate. No major waterway could supply his troops. He would have to rely on wagons and a precarious railroad to bring them food and equipment. His army would need 1,300 tons of goods every day to operate. There weren't enough rail cars on the line from Louisville to Nashville, from Nashville to Chattanooga, and from Chattanooga to his army to accommodate this amount of freight, so Sherman went about accumulating all railroad cars within his jurisdiction that he needed. Washington gave Sherman permission to shut down all traffic except for military freight. He told a Nashville commissary officer that, if you don't have my army supplied and keep it supplied, we'll eat your mules up, sir. Eat your mules up. Johnston, from January to April 1864, argued with President Davis over the strategy for dealing with the Union forces concentrated at Chattanooga. Johnston's aloofness when reporting his strength and his army's ability to operate irritated the President and the Confederate War Department. Davis wanted to invade East Tennessee, but Johnston didn't believe that he had the troop strength nor the supplies to operate in that region. The President wanted Johnston to go on the offensive and take back large sections of Tennessee. Johnston wanted to combat the Union Army in northern Georgia, defeat it in battle, and then begin an invasion of the volunteer state. Neither man was willing to budge regarding their strategy, which caused a larger rift between the two men. Johnston didn't have to deal with all the logistical problems that Sherman did. Sherman had to bring his supplies over hundreds of miles of rail in hostile territory. However, the Western and Atlantic Railroad that ran from Atlanta to the Army of Tennessee's headquarters at Dalton was state-owned and operated. At various times during the war, it was difficult to get the individual railways to agree to military efforts. Johnston informed both the governor of Georgia and the Confederate government that if the railroad wasn't organized to bring him supplies, that he would have to fall back from Dalton toward Atlanta. This scared both the governor and the Confederate authorities, and they began to pry away rail cars and engines to get supplies to Johnston. The Army of Tennessee consisted of 2 infantry corps and 1 cavalry corps and numbered somewhere around 55,000 men. William Hardee was one of the infantry corps commanders. This dependable general served with that army through some of the most brutal battles, but in the fall of 1863 he was transferred to Mississippi for a short stint and was under the command of Johnston. The two men didn't get along in Mississippi, and when Johnston came to the encampment around Dalton, the two men were still somewhat enemies. Johnston didn't make an effort to win Hardee over to his side either. He didn't seek the counsel of Hardee despite that corps commander's experience. The newest corps commander in the Army of Tennessee was the newly promoted John Bell Hood. Hood was known as an aggressive commander and dependable. Most of his Confederate military career was in Virginia with the Army of Northern Virginia. But when James Longstreet's corps came west to bolster the Army of Tennessee prior to Chickamauga, Hood came with it and stayed in the west after Longstreet returned to Virginia. Johnston liked Hood and confided in him, seeking his counsel, treating him as his second in command. Hood had 2 things going for him. Johnston liked him, and Davis liked him. Johnston's cavalry was commanded by Joseph Wheeler, a pro-Bragg supporter, but a good cavalryman. Most of the Confederate cavalry was either south of Dalton and subsisted on forage there, or in East Tennessee, helping fight back against Federal forces operating in that region. Sherman's command wasn't without its problems. The best way to describe the command would be an army group, because it was made up of 3 different armies. The largest of the armies was the Army of the Cumberland, commanded by George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga. It numbered around 75,000 men divided into 3 corps. The 4th Corps was commanded by the Eastern Theater General Oliver Otis Howard, a man who fought in some of the Army of the Potomac's bloodiest battles thus far in the conflict. The 14th Corps was commanded by a constant in the Army of the Cumberland, John M. Palmer. Palmer was a division commander during the battles of Stones River and Chickamauga, performing great service, and when Thomas was elevated to Army Command, Palmer took Thomas's position as the head of the 14th Corps. Joseph Hooker commanded the 20th Corps. The former commander of the Army of the Potomac was best known for his horrible defeat at the hands of Robert E. Lee at the Battle of Chancellorsville. He came west prior to the battles for Chattanooga and captured Lookout Mountain in that series of engagements. The Cavalry Corps was commanded by Washington Elliott. Elliott had served in the Trans-Mississippi Theater once, the Eastern Theater once, and this last transfer to the West made it his second time in the West. He had served as an infantry and cavalry commander and became a solid and dependable commander wherever he was sent. James B. McPherson commanded the Army of the Tennessee. The favorite subordinate of Sherman received that position when Sherman was placed in command of the Military Division of the Mississippi. His army was made up of 3 corps, but only 2 were with McPherson in the opening stages of the Atlanta Campaign. The Army of the Tennessee numbered about 25,000 men. John A. Logan, also known as Blackjack Logan, was another favorite of Sherman. He was given command of the 15th Corps, Sherman's old command. Logan was a veteran of the Vicksburg Campaign and gained the respect of his superiors as a tough fighter. Grenville Dodge commanded the 16th Corps. The veteran of many a battlefield and someone handpicked by President Lincoln for his railroad experience to determine the location for the beginning of the Union Pacific Railroad, made a good addition to the Army of the Tennessee. The third and final element to Sherman's Army Corps was the Army of the Ohio. John M. Schofield now commanded it, but it was started by Ambrose Burnside for his successful invasion and capture of East Tennessee. The Army of the Ohio was an army in basically name only. It consisted of 1 corps, which was also commanded by Schofield. It contained about 13,000 men and was the smallest element of Sherman's army group. In April, Grant sent instructions to Sherman. It stated, "You, I propose, to move against Johnston's army, to break it up, and to get into the interior of the enemy's country as far as you can, inflicting all the damage you can against their war resources." Sherman's plan for the Atlanta campaign relied on outmaneuvering the enemy to control key locations and force the enemy army to retreat. He wasn't a great battlefield general. His idea of waging war revolved around attacking infrastructure, not armies. Johnston, on the other hand, could never find a location that suited him, and his pessimism about the army and its landscape hindered his ability to counter the movements of Sherman. As historian Richard McMurray wrote, "The great struggle for North Georgia would be waged by one general who did not want to fight except in very limited circumstances and under conditions that seemed never to exist, and by another who preferred not to fight at all."